We are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Rick Goldsmith. Rick Goldsmith produced and directed the Academy Award-nominated documentary feature Tell the Truth and Run, George Seldes and the American Press, that was broadcast nationwide on public television and cablecast on the Sundance Channel. He recently wrote and edited Soul of Justice, Felton Henderson's American Journey, a film on a pioneering and controversial African-American jurist. And he is here to talk about his new film, which he co-produced and co-edited with Judith Ehrlich, The Most Dangerous Man in America, Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, which had its Seattle debut last night at the Varsity Theater. Start out and tell us, what was your motivation in producing The Most Dangerous Man in America?
Well, Judith was my co-director and co-producer. We kind of got together from separate points of view to do this story. I had approached Dan Ellsberg in 2002 after his book Secrets came out. Secrets, a memoir of Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers. And I knew Dan Ellsberg from a previous film that I did that you just mentioned, Tell the Truth and Run, George Seldes and the American Press. He was actually one of the interview subjects in that film because he used to read George Seldes. So I knew him briefly, and when I read his book, I just thought this was the perfect story to do a film about, somebody's transformation from being a cold warrior to being an anti-war activist. And I remembered the Pentagon Papers. When the Pentagon Papers were published by the New York Times in 1971, I was 20 years old, and it made a big impact on me. So I wrote him a note. I sent him a 2-page outline of the film, which even then I titled The Most Dangerous Man in America. But I didn't hear back from him, which is not unusual. You know, people get, swamped with things. He was probably on a book tour. And I let the matter drop. And Judy came to me a couple of years later. We worked together in Berkeley, California. A very close-knit documentary community lives there and works there. And so we knew each other, just kind of occasional friends, as fellow filmmakers. And she had done a film called The Good War and Those Who Refuse to Fight It, which was on conscientious objectors in World War II. And she came to me one day and said, "Hey, how about a film on Dan Ellsberg?" And I said, "Oh, it's funny you should mention that." And I pulled out my file folder, and there it was. And this time we were determined not to let it drop. We had 2 people. And so we contacted Dan. And actually, the first time we saw Dan that time around, which I guess was probably late 2004, he was on stage at a local high school with his wife, Patricia, and they were just doing kind of a 2-person show, for a local high school audience about those days, the Pentagon Papers, and they were charming. And what we saw there was an added bonus for us was there was a love story in the middle of this heavily political story. And we spoke to Dan and Patricia that night, and we took it from there. And that's how the project got started. Now, I would add that the political part of this was we were in the midst of 2 wars, the Iraq War and Afghanistan, which we are unfortunately still in the midst of. And the resonance, the parallel between the story of Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers and the activism against it, and the current day situation, the parallels were unmistakable. And by parallels, I mean also contrasts, because in the late 1960s, early 1970s, of course, there was a huge anti-war movement. And the country was divided, people for the war, people against the war. And the anti-war movement made it really a tremendous impact and helped end the war, in contrast to 2004, 2005, when it seemed like the Congress and the people were unable or unwilling to stop the present wars.
Was the Congress more divided back then? Just because I wasn't conscious of I was too young then to...
The Congress was very divided, and as you'll see in the film, I mean, there were many people in Congress who were very outspoken against the war, including the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, Senator Fulbright, and George McGovern, who was even then in 1970 and 71 was running for president on an anti-war platform, which he did run in 72, and many other outspoken congressmen and senators, Senator Mansfield, Senator Gravel, a whole host of people. So it was not unusual to have people outspoken in the Senate and Congress, and obviously in the general public or at rallies or whatever, speaking out against the war. And while there might have been labels of traitor or whatever, there were enough of us opposed to the war, so that didn't really mean much. That didn't deter any opposition to the war.
So you have this epic story that one would be hard-pressed to get a fiction writer to come up with anything better than Daniel Ellsberg's story.
That's true. Besides the politics of it, it was really a dramatist's dream, because the classic drama is to have a protagonist who starts at one point and does a big transformation, and we had that. This was a man who, as you see in the film, was a cold warrior, very much believed that what the United States was doing abroad was good for the other people. As he says directly in the film that it was good for the other people to be associated with the United States. We were going to help bring democracy to other countries. And certainly in Vietnam in the early 60s, they had essentially dictatorships there, and whether there was going to be a communist takeover, which people didn't know yet. Of course, the communists had taken over in the North, but not in the South, or whether you had a dictatorship. Certainly these were not free societies. So you could understand how a thinking person could say, oh, the United States is going to help bring democracy to these other countries. But as Dan Ellsberg goes through his career, which we document in the film, you see him, with one incident after another. He goes over to Vietnam. He sees what it's like. He sees the tenaciousness of the Viet Cong and how they're not going to give up, is what he says. He does a 180-degree turn and sees the war as not only unwinnable, but ultimately as immoral, as mass murder, as he puts it. But that takes a series of events that take a good third to a half of the movie to document. And then he does make his change. So you have that classic transformation. That's number one. Then you have this event, the Pentagon Papers, the publishing of the Pentagon Papers, that explodes over America. And you see all the newscasters and the journalists and the FBI manhunt for Daniel Ellsberg before he gives himself up. And then finally you have the vendetta against Ellsberg by President Nixon, who we see in strange twists of fate lead not to Ellsberg's undoing, but President Nixon's undoing.
And in working on your film, you brought out you researched a lot of Nixon tapes that had previously been untouched relatively.
That's right. The Nixon tapes, people should know, they live in the National Archives, and they're on several different websites. The Miller Center in the University of Virginia has really the complete tapes, although not logged very well, so you have to know what you're looking for. But there is an index online with the National Archives that you can research these tapes, which is exactly what we did, and looked up every reference to Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. And it is a treasure trove of information that is available to the public. So we started out on one of our trips to Washington, where we interviewed several people who were in the film. I took a day, or 2 days, I guess it was, at the National Archives and looked at, listened to the Nixon tapes there, because I had them cataloged, so I was ready. And also looked at some of the video of the nightly news broadcasts of that period, 1971 to 1973. In 71 was when the Pentagon Papers story broke, and it was on the nightly news every night. And what was interesting, and this was a godsend for us, because it helped us with our research, and it also helped us with our budget in a way that I'll explain in a bit. It was somebody's job within the White House, within the Nixon White House, to tape, and these were old 2-inch tape machines, videotape machines, the kind of the ancient versions of, now what is on DVD or digital format. It was their job to tape the nightly news and all the public affairs program. And those tapes were archived at the National Archives. So you could walk into the National Archives and pull off the shelves the screeners of Walter Cronkite Nightly News, Howard K. Smith, Harry Reasoner, John Chancellor, and every night for several weeks were 5 minutes, 8 minutes on the Pentagon Papers. And we used a lot of those clips in our film. And why I say it helped our budget is because some of that archives we just used straight from some of those archive tapes we used straight from the National Archives, and we didn't have to pay license fees to the networks because there's something called the Fair Use Doctrine, which allows you to use copyrighted material like stuff from TV stations under certain circumstances, and we got a lawyer to argue those certain circumstances, and we're able to use that. So that helped us save a few $1,000s anyway off our budget.
Yeah, I know Norman Solomon in his film War Made Easy had a big battle with the clips that they included in that.
Right. The idea of fair use is really changing right now because a number of activists associated with the documentary film community, there's a group at American University, boy, I wish I had the name at my fingertips, something like the social research or social media group. Pat Ofterheide is one of the leaders of that group, and they've done a lot of pioneering work just in the last 5 or 6 years to come up with new guidelines for fair use. And it allows then documentary filmmakers or radio producers to be able to use copyrighted material, claim that it's really belongs to the public, and not be hindered, and then able to have really public, things that serve the public reach the airwaves. There was a big fight many years ago about the PBS series Eyes on the Prize, which is a terrifically 6-part or 10-part series on the civil rights movement. And at a certain point, they couldn't show it anymore because of copyright problems. And this was a great loss to the American people because, one series of showings or 2 series of showings on PBS, and then they weren't even allowed to sell the videotapes. So this movement was in part in response to that. And now there's more available to the public, and we all benefit.
The title of your film, The Most Dangerous Man in America, where does that come from? What's the context of that?
When the Pentagon Papers were leaked to the New York Times, and it came out a few days later that the source of the leak was Daniel Ellsberg, Henry Kissinger, who actually knew Dan Ellsberg from their days at Harvard together and had consulted with Dan Ellsberg in the early days of the Nixon administration. So no, we're talking about 1969, even 1968, before they took office, after they had won the election, after Nixon had won the election and Kissinger was on his transition team. He met with Daniel Ellsberg, who was known to be an expert on the war because he had been with the Rand Corporation, which was a think tank, an independent think tank. He had served in the Pentagon, and he had served in the State Department, and he had been in Vietnam. And he had worked on the policy of waging the Vietnam War. He worked on the McNamara at one point, which you see in the film, and there's some dramatic scenes with Ellsberg and McNamara. So in this transition team, Henry Kissinger consulted with Dan Ellsberg as one of the experts and asked him to prepare some position papers, some option papers, I should say, on different strategies for the Vietnam War. That was in '69. and they met again in 1970. Flash forward to 1971, the publication of the Pentagon Papers in June, and now within the White House, they're in an uproar that this top secret document, what the Pentagon Papers were, was a report that McNamara, when he was Secretary of Defense, had sponsored on the history of Vietnam. How did we get in there? What did we do there? What mistakes were made? Maybe we'll learn something. So this report was published in the New York Times, and the Nixon and Kissinger were outraged. And Kissinger said to Nixon in the White House, Daniel Ellsberg, I wish I could do my Kissinger imitation here. Daniel Ellsberg is the most dangerous man in America, and he has to be stopped at all costs. And that's where the title came from. It actually became a well-known quote several years later.
So clarify for me, the Pentagon Papers, was that the specific report that you referenced earlier? What is the Pentagon Papers?
The Pentagon Papers, they became known as the Pentagon Papers once they were published in the New York Times. But what it was in 1967, McNamara, there's a wonderful scene in the film, actually. Let me back up a little bit. There's a wonderful scene in the film where Dan Ellsberg talks about being on a plane with McNamara on the way back from Vietnam. It was just kind of happenstance. Dan had business there and McNamara had business there, and they were both coming back to the States at the same time. And he had worked for McNamara a few years earlier. His first job in the Pentagon actually was his first day at the Pentagon, was the day of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which kicked off the escalation in 1964. The Johnson used as a way to escalate the war. In the same way that President Bush talked about the weapons of mass destruction are there in Iraq, and so that justifies us doing whatever we need to do in Iraq. Johnson used the Tonkin Gulf incident to do the same thing in Vietnam. So, of course, McNamara knew Dan Ellsberg. So now it's in 1960. Actually, this incident happened in October 1966. They're on their way back from Vietnam on a plane. And McNamara is concerned about the progress or lack thereof in Vietnam. And he says, Dan, I'm having an argument here with whoever he was flying with. He says the situation is better, and I say the situation was worse. You're the expert. What do you say? And Dan says to him, and he recounts this story, well, Mr. Secretary, I actually think it's pretty much the same as it's been. It's a stalemate. It's been a stalemate. It's still a stalemate. There's really no way out. And McNamara talks with him a little bit, and they're in somewhat agreement that the situation is really dreadful for the United States, from the United States point of view. And Dan Ellsberg tells the story, okay, the plane lands, and McNamara gets off the plane into this foggy day and walks down to this bank of reporters. Well, we got the film clip of that very day from ABC News, so we show it there. It's a terrific transition, and you see McNamara step up to the microphones with a bank of reporters speaking, and you see Dan Ellsberg walk off the plane right behind McNamara. And what McNamara says to the reporters is, oh, I'm very encouraged with our progress. It's never been better, et cetera, et cetera. And Daniel Ellsberg says, I just thought, wow, I hope I'm never in a job where I have to lie like that. So that was what McNamara was about then. But interestingly enough, behind closed doors, he did really express his doubts to President Johnson. And this is very well documented, but that by late 1966 and early 1967, he was telling Johnson that we should be seeking a political solution in Vietnam and not the military solution that was failing. But Johnson didn't listen. And McNamara, unlike Dan Ellsberg, didn't speak out. He was a bureaucrat. He was a Secretary of Defense. He was loyal to his commander-in-chief. And he didn't speak out. But what he did do was authorize a study to look into the origins of the Vietnam War. And that's the study that 40 people worked on. It was 7,000 pages. It was 47 volumes. and it became known as the Pentagon Papers. And we have a gentleman who was ahead of that study, Morton Halpern, who says in the film, it was a top secret study, but it wasn't top secret to keep from the Vietnamese or the Russians or the Chinese, who could care less what we wrote in the report. It was top secret to keep it from President Johnson, because if he knew we were doing the study, we feared that if he knew, he would just shut it down. And that's kind of a remarkable statement to make. And the irony is that the study never would have been known, because by the time it was complete, McNamara was out, and shortly thereafter, Nixon was elected, and it's well documented that Kissinger knew about the report and didn't care about the report, and it would have gone right into the trash, but for Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked it to the press a year or two later.
Just about 5 minutes left. Probably not enough time to really do this question justice, but one of the key people that Daniel Ellsberg met that changed him to the person he is today was meeting Randy Keeler. Can you talk about how that changed him, and then how that was like a cascading series of events?
Randy Keeler was a draft resistor, and Dan Ellsberg, whose mind was already changing in 1969, he's having severe doubts about the war, went to a conference that Randy Keeler spoke at and heard Randy Keeler say that, I'm about to go to prison, and I'm going to join my fellow resistors, one of whom was David Harris, the husband of Joan Baez, who was going to prison for the same reason. And his speech had such an effect on Daniel Ellsberg. And when he recounts this, even on the film, he breaks down. He starts to tear up about what a profound influence that had on him. And it was a kind of a catharsis for him. After he heard the speech, he said to himself, now what can I do now that I'm ready to go to prison to help end this war? And that set off him on the events to Xerox the study with the help of Anthony Russo, who had been a colleague of his at the Rand Corporation, and then everything that followed.
And at some point, after having released the Pentagon Papers, he was very, I think, depressed over his realizing that it wasn't going to stop the war. He thought it was going to put the brakes on it relatively soon.
Well, the Pentagon Papers made quite a splash in 1971. But like anything else in America, a month later, it wasn't in the news so much. And several months later, it wasn't in the news. And people kind of forgot about it. And what we see by 1972 is the country, even though there's a terrific anti-war sentiment, goes ahead and reelects President Nixon, who already was under the cloud of the Watergate scandal. And they not only reelected him, but it was one of the largest landslides in American history, where he won 49 out of 50 states. And Dan was somewhat despondent about that. But he says now later that when you're active, when you speak out, you don't know who you're touching. You don't know at the time. You can't know. And you just do it because it's right. Randy Keeler never could have imagined in his wildest dreams that a person named Dan Ellsberg would be listening to him, and that the words that Randy Keeler spoke indirectly, really directly, led to the Pentagon Papers, one of the most dramatic events of that era. And in twists and turns that you'll see in the film, led to the demise of President Nixon.
Only a few minutes left. We are talking with Rick Goldsmith. He is co-producer and co-editor of the new documentary.
Co-producer and co-director.
Of the new documentary film, The Most Dangerous Man in America, Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. And that is showing tonight again.
That's showing tonight and all week at least at the Varsity here in Seattle and at the Grand in Tacoma and all over the country. And it was just nominated for an Academy Award. We just came back from the Oscars, which was a terrifically exciting experience. And it's showing throughout the country. We have a website, mostdangerousman.org, mostdangerousman.org, And with a couple of clicks, you can see where it's showing around the country. We're kind of cascading it roughly a dozen cities at a time. So if you know people in other cities like Chicago and Philadelphia and Detroit and Lincoln, Nebraska and wherever, you tell your friends there. And it's also available for educators who would want to use this film in their classroom, and whether colleges, universities, high schools, public libraries, community organizations, political organizations. So again, a couple of clicks on mostdangerousman.org. The DVD for educational use is on newday.com, but you can get to it through our website. And we have a small but determined outreach campaign. So we depend on word of mouth. So anything that listeners can do to spread the word, to get people out both here in the Seattle-Tacoma area and across the country would be a tremendous help, because it's a film that we feel like can change minds. And who's your target audience for this film? Our target audience, besides saying the general public, is young people, really. People who can be moved, who are at a time in their lives. I think it's typical of young people that they want to make a difference in this world. And we live in a time where the politics are very complicated, a lot of challenges ahead. People look at how overwhelming things seem to be, how hard it is to stop escalation in yet another war in Afghanistan, and sometimes retreat and say, why bother? And we feel like you watch this film, and maybe that will be an answer to that question. Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning. I enjoyed it.